And we'll give it a second for folks to join. Thank you, everyone who's joining. We're just letting folks come in and then we'll get started for today. All right, thanks for everyone who's joining. We're going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully folks will continue to join as we go. My name is Jan Morrill. I'd like to thank everyone who's attending this webinar on sustainable solutions to risky mine tailings management. I am the Tailings Campaign Manager at Earthworks. Earthworks is an organization based in the United States that has 30 years of experience working with frontline communities affected by extraction projects like hard rock mining, oil, and natural gas, as well as looking for sustainable solutions to these projects. Today, we're going to hear a panel with perspectives on how to improve mine waste storage facilities, as well as how to promote best practices to align with social and environmental standards. And I'm really excited that we're going to have a diverse panel that can speak to Indigenous community rights, frontline community rights, as well as the nexus between human rights and tailings management. So I'd like to introduce our panel today. First, we're going to hear a brief introduction from Dr. Marcos Orellana, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. Professor Orellana is an expert in international law and law on human rights and the environment. In his practice as a legal advisor, he has worked with the United Nations agencies, governments, and non-governmental agencies. Professor Orellana was the inaugural director of the Environment and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. He previously directed the Trade and Human Rights Program at the Center for International Environmental Law. And he has been the co-chair of the UN Environment Program's Civil Society Forum. Next, we will hear from Kukpi7 Judy Wilson. She has served her community for 10 years as chief of the Nisconlith Indian Band and as secretary-treasurer of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. She's a strong advocate for the recognition of inherent title rights, self-determination, and for the fundamental shifts needed for the survival of all peoples. Chief Wilson's education includes public administration with a focus on governance, public relations, and media. After Chief Judy, we will hear from Elisa Estrinioli, a member of the National Leadership Team for the Movement of People Affected by Dams in Brazil, known as MAB. MAB has worked since the 1980s to organize across Brazil to defend the rights of communities affected by hydroelectric and mining dams. Elisa lives in the town of Altamira in the state of Pará in the Brazilian Amazon, in a region affected by the Belo Monte Dam. Then we'll finish up with Dr. Stephen Emerman. Dr. Emerman has 31 years of experience teaching hydrology and geophysics and 70 peer-reviewed publications on this area. Dr. Emerman has a BS in mathematics from Ohio State, an MA in geophysics from Princeton, and a PhD in geophysics from Cornell. He is the owner of Malak Consulting and specializes in evaluating environmental impacts of mining projects for mining companies, governments, and non-governmental organizations. He is also an author of Safety First, Guidelines for Responsible Mine Tailings Management. And then we will finish with a short video from Hassan Lobrecht, the lead on advocacy and support at the Benchmarks Foundations in South Africa. Benchmarks Foundations is committed to providing leadership and advocacy for benchmarking of good corporate practices, ethical and socially responsible investment, as well as linking people and institutions committed to these ideas. So before we begin our panel today, I would just like to give a brief context of why this is important to talk about this issue here at the UNEA Assembly. As the world pushes towards a green transition to avoid the worst effects of climate change, mining has become a key industry in the race to build greener technologies. However, mining is one of the most polluting industries in the world. Irresponsible mining practices lead to air, water, and soil contamination, as well as human rights violations and indigenous rights violations. As the world pushes for more mining to build these greener technologies, we are creating more mine waste. One form of mine waste is tailings. Tailings are what's left over once the commodity of value, be it gold, nickel, iron, silver, is extracted from the ore body. And tailings contain crushed rock, water, and the chemicals used during the mineral processing. According to the US Geological Survey, 86% of what is extracted during the mining process is waste. And there's an estimated 44.5 billion cubic meters of waste stored in the about 1,700 tailings dams registered in the Global Tailings Portal. However, that's not all the tailings dams that exist in the world. It's estimated there's between 20 and 30,000 tailings dams across the globe, and that number is continually increasing. So what are the risks of tailings dams? Typically, tailings are stored permanently behind an earthen dam made out of waste, including tailings. They can reach over 100 meters high, and tailings dams are some of the largest man-made structures on the face of the earth. Studies have shown that tailings facilities are failing with increasing frequency and severity. There are a number of factors that cause tailings dams to fail, but when they do, they have devastating consequences. During a dam failure, toxic waste can flow at speeds of up to 120 kilometers per hour and cover hundreds of kilometers of downstream terrain. So today we're going to hear firsthand about the devastating ecological and community effects of tailings dam failures from Chief Judy and Elisa. And so while safer ways to store tailings exist, the mining industry is broadly ignoring them. Mining companies continue to put profits over safety, opting for the cheapest technologies instead of those that will protect the communities and ecosystems downstream. Regulators, international agencies, and investors need to hold mining companies accountable and ensure that they move towards safety. Measures like banning upstream tailings dam, requiring community consent, and mandating the use of safest technologies needs to come from governments and international agencies, as well as standard setters. There have been a number of efforts in recent years to de-risk tailings dams. In 2020, UNEP, with a group of investors at PRI and the mining industry trade organization ICMM, released the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management. And while this standard is the first of its kind and an important first step in safer tailings management, we hope that it will continue to improve and set the bar higher moving forward. Last year, UNEP and PRI announced they will be forming an independent tailings management institute, and we're hopeful that this institute can create the much needed independent oversight the mining industry needs. And here at UNEA, Switzerland has led the effort to introduce a resolution on addressing the detrimental impacts of mining. And while these are all important steps, we need to do more. Now is the time to take decisive action to protect communities and ecosystems. In July of 2020, Earthworks and our partner organizations released a report called Safety First, Guidelines for Responsible Mine Tailings Management. It sets out 16 guidelines that from a civil society and community perspective need to be promoted to ensure safety. And we'll hear more about that from Dr. Emerman. And then lastly, I just want to say that the safest tailings dam is the one that is not built. We must look for ways to reduce the amount of tailings produced and therefore reduce the overall demand for primary raw materials. This will help us avoid the long-term liability of waste sites and their social and environmental impacts. But this is going to require a commitment to develop better technology design for reuse and recycling of metals. It's going to require mining operations to adhere to stringent, independent environmental human rights standards with consent from fully informed communities. And it's going to require a transformation in energy consumption, including the way we conceive of public transport and design our cities. Sustainable production that protects ecosystems and communities must be front and center as we mine metals, and mine waste is one of the largest liabilities to sustainable development. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Marcos Orellana to give us a brief context on the nexus between tailings and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you to Earthworks for the invitation. Some points that you made, Jan. First, concerns. I was just in an academy from water had been contaminated for decades all around the country by extractive industries. One element of the risks posed to human rights by extractive industries are tailing dams. And as you mentioned, Jan, tailing dam ruptures, they pose severe impacts on human rights. The recent disasters in Mariana and Brumadinho in Brazil speak of that very clearly. The images and the headlines were so clear in terms of the loss of life, the loss of livelihoods, the wholesale environmental destruction. So in the face of risk and in the face of these huge impacts to human rights, what do human rights actually require states to do? And I would like to spend a couple of minutes on that point. There is very important jurisprudence coming out from the European Court of Human Rights out of two cases where there have been tailing dam ruptures. One of them is Bahia Mare in Romania. Back in 2000, the release of 100,000 cubic meters of contaminated cyanide tailings. The European Court went on to speak to the duties of the state regarding access to information, positive duties to warn the population that could be impacted. It found that the state of Romania had failed in this regard. So there's one point there, emergency systems, but even more, information as a tool for prevention and for enabling meaningful participation in the design of policies to address the risks. The Bahia Mare case, also known as Tatar versus Romania, given the names of the victims involved, elaborated on the relevance of environmental principles in human rights law. The principle of precaution, for example. So even in the face of scientific uncertainties, the importance of the states taking action to address risk. And similarly, the principle of prevention. This is a very interesting construct because in international environmental law, the principle of prevention is often articulated in regards to transboundary issues. It's been articulated in Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment. It has been recognized at this stage, 50 years later, to be a core element of customary international environmental law. What the European Court of Human Rights does in this case of Tatar is to take that principle and extend its application, not just from the context of transboundary issues, but also to apply in situations involving human rights. And so duties of prevention, duties of due diligence are key in fulfilling state obligations in the face of risk. As I mentioned earlier, there's another case that's relevant here is the Budayeva versus Russia, where a mudslide caused a catastrophe in the town of Ternolz in Russia. Now, what all this goes to say is that the risks that the tailings dams place, they need to be addressed effectively. And human rights and human rights law establishes very clearly positive duties of protection on states to prevent loss of life and interference with the range of rights that are impacted when these dams rupture. Now, due diligence has come up as a standard in order to test whether the state may be responsible or have responsibility for or in an incident of tailings dam rupture. Now, what does due diligence require? In an abstract sense, it requires all that is humanly possible to prevent interference with human rights in the face of the circumstances. We're speaking here about the highest standards of prevention to avert interference with the right to life, with the right to health, and certainly with the right to a healthy environment. In understanding the content of due diligence, science and technical standards do come to play. And that is why the discussion in today's panel is such an important moment and such an important contribution, because due diligence, in order to operationalize it, the information, the analysis of technical standards, of science is particularly relevant. These are some introductory remarks I thought I'd share with you today about tailings dams and human rights. I very much look forward to hearing the other panelists. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Now we will turn it over to Kukpi7 Judy Wilson to share her experiences around tailings dams and their effects on the First Nations in her area. With you.
Request Kukpi7 Judy Wilson, Skajin Te Sequetum Ulu. So I just introduced myself in my language, which is Sequetum, which is in English Shishwap, and I come from the Sequetum Nation. I'm calling in from my home community, our reserve, which were still wards of the government, under the colonial regime. But of course, our people don't feel that way. We think of ourselves as sovereign or free of the state, but the Canadian government policies place us as wards of the government, and we have what's called a status number. And they actually placed us on small reserves, which is 1% of our territory, in our case, 180,000 square kilometers, which is Sequetum Ulu. And I'm on the Nisquamish Indian Reserve, where I'm calling in from Chase, BC, Canada. And I'm very happy to be here to speak to the UN Environmental Assembly panel to share our experience in regards to mining in our territory. And as you know, in British Columbia, Canada, it's an international hub for mining for a long time. And the need to shift toward renewable energy is increasing as the global demand for minerals, especially for newer technology that's being sought for. What I wanted to speak about this morning was about the Mount Poly mining tailing pond disaster that happened in 2014, which is probably a few hours away from where I am. And a dam failed and released millions of tons of toxic waste from a tailing pond of a copper and gold mine called Mount Poly. It's owned by Imperial Metals. It's the same mine that was trying to develop just above in our headwaters, above in our community of Chase, of Nisquamish and Adams Lake and Little Shishwap Lake. They had another mine, I think, called Red Chris Mine in northern BC. It destroyed a lot of the sensitive fish habitat in the watershed and forced drinking water bans into the communities downstream. And my aunt lived there for a long time, and she actually had leukemia. There were a lot of health hazards from that were reported and unreported from that community. And I think there was also concern that the tailing ponds were leaching for like 20 years into the lake. The mine did apply to have the lake as a tailing pond, which was denied earlier, but when the dam bursted, it went into the lake, so they got their way anyway. And there's been no consequences, no charges, no nothing materialized out of any of the investigations that went on. Even from the RCMP one, we've heard nothing. And then they were trying to say it was an act of God, a natural disaster that happened, why it failed. So 8 years later, there is still a lack of trust in the mining industry from those affected by the disaster. And we have lingering concerns about drinking water quality and like how the possible contamination of the salmon in those waterways. My mother's from that area, so she said that lake turns over every 10 years. So we're at 8 years. So if they've been doing water testing, a lot of the minerals went to the bottom of the lake. So it's slowly turning over, and in a few more years, there will be more concern because if it takes like 10 years to turn over, that would be very devastating. And so Canada nor the British Columbia province has done really nothing about this tailing pond disaster, and it was equated as a world disaster. The importance of salmon to our Secwepemc people, we rely on it for our food and in every shape of the form of our Indigenous economy. It's difficult to overstate the critical importance of salmon to all of our nations along the whole waterway from the interior to the ocean. Salmon have sustained our people for thousands of years since colonization, and the salmon stocks in our territories have been disastrously mismanaged by Canada. And we're home to the world-renowned Adams Salmon River Run, but the fish haven't been coming back for a lot of reasons. The mining disasters, one. The man-made disasters that spill toxic waste into salmon waterways don't happen in isolation. Salmon are already being pushed to the brink of collapse from overharvesting, fish farming, those different viruses, Atlantic virus, deforestation, and various climate impacts. And we've had a lot of climate impacts here in our province. Before the disaster, the average family in First Nations whose territory would harvest and process up to 200 salmon each year. In our family, it was 300 because we had 8 children in our family. And there's no replacement for the cultural pillar that salmon mean to us in our communities. In the context of climate change, with the onset of severe climate impacts, communities across our province are concerned about their safety if a similar disaster were to strike a mine upriver due to extreme weather event. And we did have a mining review, and there were a number of mines identified that had serious concerns and issues, but we've never heard back if they were ever corrected or if they were ever mitigated. Our region is increasingly experiencing severe climate impacts. Last year, we had a heat dome that killed almost up to 600 people in our province alone. We had wildfires, and we had flooding that shut down one of our main highways through the province, the Trans-Canada Highway, for several months. These impacts compounded the stresses that are already affecting our community and ecosystem. They have the potential to cause other mining tailing pond disasters as they become more frequent. I don't think there's been much done at all in regards to climate change and mining disasters. There hasn't been a lot of progress from subsequent provincial governments in addressing the underlying safety concerns that led to the Mount Polly disaster. In British Columbia, we have passed Bill 41, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act to implement. And the free, prior, informed consent is an issue in mining. Article 29 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage of hazardous materials shall take place on lands or territories of Indigenous people without their free, prior, informed consent. And I could tell you that hasn't happened. If Imperial Metals were required to work with Hushault and Williams Lake Indian Band nations to establish an informed consent before mining, perhaps the safety concerns of storing toxic waste so close to waterways used by our communities and the salmon and other wildlife would have led to safer construction, but they had no membrane. It was a disastrous way they even put in Mount Poly mine to begin with. And our other nations, which are downstream from the Secwepemc entire nation, we have 17 communities, which used to be 32. We were not consulted either. Dr. Emerman's report includes many recommendations for reforming mining legislation in BC to make mining a safer industry for communities and ecosystems, including a recommendation for mines to require Indigenous and community consent before building, expanding, or closing facilities. That's a really positive development in how to think about mine safety holistically, prioritizing transparency and accountability and a minimum standard of consent. There are safer ways to mine that we've seen in Canada, and a safe mining industry is going to be important to be a transition to a sustainable economy. In British Columbia, most Indigenous lands have never ceded or surrendered or sold, so the ownership of mineral rights belong to First Nations. It's well within our rights to demand that a mining company operates safely within our territories. The First Nations Energy Mining Council, based in BC, released a comprehensive report earlier this month with 25 recommendations for establishing a framework for establishing free, prior, informed consent in Indigenous lands. The implications of free, prior, informed consent on mineral governments are significant, and self-determination, which is Article 3. It's critical to learn from the mistakes and complacency that led to previous disasters, and to elevate the stories of the nations that are affected and those individuals, which we hold human rights to now, because we have federal legislation that was adopted in Canada as well as British Columbia. And we're in the process of developing action plans right now, but we are calling for the full implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a human rights framework. But first and foremost, we have our Indigenous laws, jurisdiction, and legal orders that we're still intact with our land rights. So that's a really another important basis, because we have our land rights, our land laws, and we also have our jurisdiction. Then you have the human rights that lay over it. So we want to make sure that our land rights and our title are never affected. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions that's after. And also thank my fellow panelists as well. Thank you. Kukpi7.
Can you hear me now? Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chief Judy, for that important intervention and the points that you raised. Just a reminder to everyone that if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, and we will hope to have some time at the end to get to those. But now I'd like to turn it over to Elisa from the Movement of People Affected by Dams in Brazil. Elisa, con você.
Oi, Eline, você consegue me ouvir bem? Vou tentar. Eu vou colocar a tela aqui para compartilhar, e aí você me confirma se está dando para ver, tá bom? Conseguem ver a apresentação? Continua vendo agora? Continua vendo? Sim, tá bom. Bom, então, bom dia a todos. Eu sou Elisa, sou do Movimento dos Atingidos por Barragens do Brasil. Gostaria de agradecer a Jan e a Earthworks pelo convite para participar dessa conversa, também a Eline, que está fazendo a tradução para a gente. Bom, eu faço parte do MAB, que é um movimento de pessoas atingidas por barragem no Brasil, que tem uma história de mais de 30 anos de organização com as comunidades atingidas e que hoje está em todas as regiões do Brasil, de norte a sul do país. E o movimento ele organiza famílias atingidas por hidrelétricas e também por barragens de rejeitos. Uma imagem de uma das mobilizações do movimento, essa é a nossa bandeira, a bandeira do MAB. Qual a situação das barragens no Brasil atualmente? Esses dados que eu estou apresentando são do último relatório sobre a situação das barragens no Brasil. Então, nós temos hoje no Brasil 21.953 barragens registradas. Esse número inclui barragens de rejeito e também barragens de hidrelétrica, reservatórios para acumulação de água. Deixa eu não estar passando. Tá. Posso deixar assim, porque quando eu coloco na tela toda, ele não está passando para vocês. Pode ser assim? Então, tá. Então, vamos lá, então. Bom, então, das barragens do Brasil, poucas são fiscalizadas. No último período, a gente teve só 303 fiscalizações nesse universo todo de barragens. Mais da metade das barragens registradas no Brasil não tem informação sobre quem são os proprietários dessas estruturas. E só 28% delas têm um plano de segurança de barragens. Então, uma situação de muita falta de informação, de muita fragilidade estrutural nas barragens do Brasil que a gente tem vivenciar hoje, né? Essa situação de rompimentos e também de vazamento nessas estruturas, ela é pior na estação chuvosa no Brasil, que corresponde a esse momento que a gente está agora, né, janeiro, fevereiro, até março. As mudanças climáticas, o fato dessas estruturas estarem envelhecendo, né? Muitas dessas barragens têm mais de 30 anos, por exemplo, e a falta também de fiscalização aumentam o problema. E hoje no Brasil a gente vive também uma destruição no processo de licenciamento ambiental. Então isso agrava também a situação dos projetos atualmente. Sobre rupturas de barragens, vazamentos e erosões nessas estruturas, eu vou trazer aqui alguns exemplos, principalmente em Minas Gerais, mas também em outras regiões do Brasil, como no próprio estado do Pará e no Maranhão, que dão um panorama de como está a situação hoje no Brasil, né? Então, em 2015, teve a ruptura da barragem de Fundão, em Mariana, no estado de Minas Gerais, uma barragem que é da Samarco, que é uma companhia formada pela Vale e pela BHP Billiton. 19 pessoas morreram, né? Uma mulher sofreu um aborto e 4,3 milhões de metros cúbicos de lama, né, com rejeitos, foram despejadas no Rio Doce, devastando toda a bacia desse rio, afetando 40 cidades, com 1,4 milhão de pessoas, e todo esse caminho, né? E até o momento, 344 famílias foram cadastradas para serem reassentadas, terem suas casas reconstruídas, porém até hoje, 7 anos após esse crime, somente 10 casas foram construídas para esses atingidos. Aqui um exemplo de um dos atingidos, né, o seu Elias Oliveira, mora numa comunidade que foi devastada também pela lama de Mariana, e ele está olhando para a ruína de uma das casas de uns familiares seus. A comunidade ainda não foi reconstruída, essa ainda é a situação hoje de lá. Uma mobilização, então pedindo justiça em uma das comunidades atingidas pelo crime da Samarco, da Vale BHP. Pouco tempo depois, então, em 2019, aconteceu outro crime relacionado com uma empresa, com a Vale, né? Que foi o rompimento da barragem de Córrego do Feijão, em Brumadinho, em que 270 pessoas morreram, sendo 240 delas trabalhadores da empresa. A lama se espalhou também por mais de 300 quilômetros. Os indígenas, Pataxó e comunidades quilombolas, né, comunidades tradicionais do povo negro, foram atingidos também no caminho. E 100 mil pessoas estão cadastradas hoje para receber um auxílio emergencial por conta da destruição das suas condições de vida, e mais de 600 mil pessoas ainda hoje sofrem prejuízo no acesso à água por conta desse crime. Aqui a imagem do helicóptero buscando fazer resgate, né, das vítimas na época. Mais uma mobilização denunciando os crimes de Mariana e Brumadinho. E aí eu ressalto que a Vale, a companhia Vale Mineradora Transnacional hoje, mesmo após esses crimes, no ano passado a empresa registrou o seu recorde de lucros. Então, qual a mensagem que isso passa? Que esse tipo de crime, ele compensa. Ele não impacta de maneira alguma os lucros dessas empresas, né? E essa situação também, nesse período, ela se agrava com as chuvas, né? Por exemplo, hoje a lama está embaixo dos rios, mas com as enchentes nesse período chuvoso, há várias inundações, e essa lama que estava já no leito dos rios, ela voltou a atingir e a inundar as casas das famílias que moram na vizinhança desses rios. Né? Então, uma situação, um crime que vai se repetindo e se agravando com as chuvas, com as mudanças climáticas também, e que ainda hoje não foi feita uma reparação justa para essas famílias. Aqui na Amazônia, né, eu moro aqui no estado do Pará, então aqui na nossa região também tem crimes dessa natureza, que não chegou a ser uma ruptura nessas estruturas, mas que foi um vazamento numa mina da companhia Hidronorte, em Barcarena, que contaminou o rio Mucuripe, e com metais pesados como chumbo, arsênico e mercúrio, atingiu de 15 a 20 mil famílias, em 80 comunidades, às margens do rio, e apenas 1.500 famílias foram reconhecidas como atingidas pela empresa, ou seja, uma prática também já das empresas de não reconhecer todos os atingidos, apenas uma parte deles para compensação. Aqui uma foto de como ficou o rio Mucuripe após esse vazamento. Outro caso de vazamento nessas estruturas, muito recente também, do ano passado, foi no estado do Maranhão, na região nordeste do Brasil. Então vejam como em várias regiões do país acontecem isso, né? Aconteceu no Sudeste, em Minas Gerais, na Amazônia também, e também no Maranhão, na região Nordeste. Estão espalhados por todo o território. Então foi um vazamento de uma barragem da empresa Equinox Gold, que contaminou o rio Tromaí, em Aurizona, município de Aurizona. Mais de 4 mil pessoas ficaram sem água, sem fornecimento de água. A empresa Equinox Gold foi obrigada a fornecer água mineral para as famílias atingidas, porém a quantidade foi insuficiente. E, além disso, as famílias tiveram acesso à sua comunidade interditada pelo vazamento da lama. Então, ficaram sem acesso. Aqui uma imagem, então, dessa mina da Equinox Gold, desse vazamento. Mais um exemplo recente também em Minas Gerais, que é sobre a barragem de Casa da Pedra, que é da Companhia Siderúrgica Nacional, que é uma barragem que ela foi fechada, né? Ela está sem utilização após serem detectados vazamentos e erosões na sua estrutura. É uma barragem de rejeitos enorme, maior que a barragem de Brumadinho, por exemplo, e ela está acima de uma comunidade, ela está muito próxima do município de Congonhas, como vocês podem ver nessa imagem. A barragem de rejeitos lá em cima, e aqui embaixo, muito próximo, já está as famílias aqui, mais de 5 mil famílias desse bairro do município de Congonhas, em Minas Gerais. Esse ano também teve mais um vazamento nesse tipo de estrutura, né, de minas de rejeito, de barragem de rejeitos, da empresa Valorec, né, que rompeu uma parte da sua estrutura e causou um alagamento que, inclusive, interditou a rodovia, agora na época chuvosa, também lá em Minas Gerais. Essa é uma imagem dessa ruptura parcial, digamos assim, né, que teve nessa barragem de mina de Pau Branco, da Valorec em Minas Gerais. Então, esse panorama, eu trouxe alguns exemplos recentes, né, que teve desses rompimentos e vazamentos dessas estruturas no Brasil, para dar uma dimensão da situação que a gente está vivendo, né? De 2015 até agora, praticamente temos um evento desse por ano acontecendo em diferentes regiões do Brasil. E estamos enfrentando também aqui na região que eu vivo, que é a região de Altamira, no Pará, no Xingu, a ameaça de um novo projeto extrativo também, que é de mineração de ouro da Belosan, uma empresa canadense, que quer criar a maior mina a céu aberto de ouro no Brasil. Pretende remover 50 toneladas de ouro daqui da região, causando uma pilha de rejeitos do tamanho do Pão de Açúcar, vocês conhecem lá no Rio de Janeiro, e com uma barragem de rejeitos 1,5 vezes o tamanho da barragem que rompeu em Mariana. É uma região que ela já sofre os impactos da hidrelétrica de Belo Monte, então se esse projeto da Belosan realmente se realizar, vai ter uma sobreposição de impactos aqui na nossa região. A companhia ainda não recebeu a licença de instalação, só que ela já vem causando conflitos na comunidade e pressionando as instituições do Brasil para que emitam essa licença, apesar de todas as irregularidades que está tendo nesse processo. Aqui a comunidade, a terra indígena Paxamba, que é do povo Juruna, que é uma das comunidades que vai ser atingida se for, de fato, efetivado esse projeto. Aqui um protesto que o MAB fez aqui em Altamira, denunciando também o projeto de Belosan e relacionando ele aos crimes de Mariana e Brumadinho. E, por fim, um pouco qual a perspectiva do MAB com relação a isso, né? Então, o movimento, ele luta por uma política nacional de direito para as populações atingidas por barragens, que ainda não existe no Brasil. O MAB luta também por uma política de segurança de barragens que seja abrangente para todos os tipos de barragem e que seja que torne possível uma maior fiscalização dessas estruturas que já existem e a sua segurança, e que leve em consideração, sobretudo, os atingidos e os ameaçados por essa estrutura. Essas duas políticas que são propostas do MAB, elas estão em tramitação de alguma forma no Congresso Nacional hoje, só que elas encontram muita resistência das empresas, sobretudo das mineradoras, e também de políticos tradicionais ligados ao setor, e por isso elas ainda não se tornaram realidade, mas é uma luta que é uma das principais bandeiras do MAB. Nós exigimos também, pautamos o respeito para que os atingidos, os ameaçados, as comunidades tradicionais sejam consultadas e possam, de fato, decidir sobre esses projetos, porque hoje o processo de consulta, ele é só formal, ele não é efetivo, nós não temos poderes de fato, nossas opiniões não são levadas em consideração na aprovação desses projetos. E o MAB também pauta que o Brasil adote um modelo energético e um modelo de extração mineral que ele seja guiado pela soberania, que ele seja pautado pela distribuição da riqueza, porque hoje o modelo que a gente tem no Brasil, extrativo, ele não serve para trazer bem-estar, não serve para enfrentar nossos problemas estruturais da desigualdade, e que ele tenha também, a gente fala, controle popular sobre todo esse processo, que o povo de fato possa ser soberano nas tomadas de decisões relativas ao modelo econômico, relativas ao modelo extrativo, relativas à relação com a natureza. Então, essas são as demandas, as pautas do MAB hoje. Por fim, uma outra mobilização nossa, ali na faixa está escrito: pelos direitos e segurança dos atingidos e atingidas por barragens. Água e energia não são mercadorias, que é um lema nosso. Muito obrigada. Isso.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Now, next we will go to Dr. Stephen Emerman to share best practices on how we can improve safety at tailings facilities. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Jan. How is the sound? Do I sound okay? I guess so. So I will share my screen. Okay, wait 1 second. And I'm going to show a PowerPoint here. Okay, ready to go? So I'm going to speak about safety first, guidelines for responsible mine tailings management. This was a document published by Earthworks and Mining Watch Canada in June 2020. This document has a focus on engineering safety and community consent. Safety First is available in Spanish, Portuguese, and Indonesian, and soon in Turkish. Okay, Safety First has been endorsed by over 150 non-governmental organizations and political parties. For example, by the Spanish political party Bloque Nacionalista Gallego. Okay, so let me see if I skipped a slide here. The slides are not advancing very nicely, so let me try one more here. Okay. So what kind of document is Safety First? We say that Safety First is an ultra-conservative document. Okay, so what does that mean? In the area of dam engineering, conservative means protective of people, property, and the environment. So our attention is to be ultra-protective of people, property, and the environment. It means that we looked at the existing guidance documents and legislation and regulation on tailings dams. And in all cases, we chose the most conservative. Okay, so there's 16 guidelines to Safety First, and I'm going to talk through 8 of the guidelines, so half of them just in the interest of time. Okay, so Guideline 1 makes safety the guiding principle in design, construction, operation, and closure. The guideline begins with the ultimate goal of tailings management must be zero harm to people and the environment and zero tolerance for human fatalities. Okay, Guideline 2, ban new tailings facilities immediately upstream from inhabited areas. Now, there are examples of this kind of legislation in Brazil, in Ecuador, and in China. Not in all of Brazil, but in the state of Minas Gerais. The legislation in Minas Gerais identifies what they call the self-rescue zone. It's the zone in which no one's going to come from the outside to rescue you. You're going to have to rescue yourself. And according to this legislation, the self-rescue zone is 10 kilometers downstream from a tailings dam along the course of a valley, or the portion of the valley that can be reached by the tailings flood wave within 30 minutes. The regulatory authorities can increase that to 25 kilometers, taking into account the population density and the natural and cultural heritage. So 30 minutes, we ask, is that actually reasonable? Can you actually evacuate every member of a community, that is small children, elderly, disabled, within 30 minutes? And that's actually quite unlikely. Okay, so what we say is that although these limits can be seen as progress compared to a lack of any regulation, they are arbitrary and will not necessarily ensure safe evacuation in every situation. Therefore, minimum distance between communities and new dams must be defined on a case-by-case basis. That means that if a tailings flood would reach a community in 2 hours and it takes 3 hours to evacuate the community, the tailings dam should be a no-go. Okay, and this principle is being violated in spades in many parts of the world. We see below there's a tailings dam at the proposed Todu copper mine in Spain. It would be only 200 meters from the village of Arentero. That parked car is right on the main street of the village. That line of trees in the background would be the edge of the tailings dam. Let's see, waiting for another slide. Okay. I know I skipped one here. Why is this slow? Okay, so one more slide. This is not advancing very nicely, and I think it might be better to go out of full screen mode. Okay, let's try this. Okay, I'm going to take it here. Okay, so before talking about the other guidelines, I'm going to give a bit of a technical interlude. Okay, so here's an example of a tailings facility. This is the Highland Valley Copper Mine in British Columbia. And what we have here is a pipe and spigots coming from the ore processing plant. And there'll be a mix of tailings and water being injected hydraulically in the upstream direction, that is toward your left. Okay, and these tailings can have 150 to 400% water. The coarser tailings will settle closer to the dam crest to form a beach, and the finer tailings and water will be carried farther to the left in the upstream direction to form a settling pond. Okay, now the problem is that these kinds of facilities are highly susceptible to failure by liquefaction. Okay, let me explain that idea. On the left, we see solids that are very loosely packed. The pores are filled with water, but the solids touch each other, so the solids support the load. Now, if that is disturbed, those solid particles will try to consolidate, but if that happens quickly, which it does, the water doesn't have time to escape. So instead, the water is pressurized, and so the solids don't touch each other any longer, and the entire mass behaves like a liquid, which of course is exactly what happened at Brumadinho and Samarco. Now, that liquefaction is promoted by loose packing, that is a lack of compaction, which is characteristic of conventional tailings storage facilities, and also the pores between the tailings being saturated with water. Okay. Now, the Mount Poly expert panel report defined what they called as the best available technology with 3 components. 1, eliminate surface water from the impoundment. 2, promote unsaturated conditions in the tailings with drainage provisions. And 3, achieve dilettante conditions throughout the tailings deposit by compaction. Okay, now if tailings are in a dilettante or dilative state, that means they've been compacted so that if you disturb them, they will tend to expand rather than contract, which will avoid liquefaction. Okay, now, according to the Mount Poly report, filter tailings technology embodies all 3 BAT components. Okay, and it means that the whole mass of water and tailings is not sent to the tailings storage facility, but first the tailings are filtered so they have less than 25% water content and behave more like a moist soil than a wet slurry. Okay, the advantage of filtering is that the tailings can then be compacted in the tailings storage facility, which avoids liquefaction. Okay, the next technical point is what is called the upstream construction method for tailings dams. Okay, we start with a starter dike and inject tailings in the upstream direction toward your left. As the tailings fill up close to the top of the starter dike, more dikes are built to contain more tailings, go from steps 1, 2, 3, 4. But we see those dikes are built in the upstream direction, so the dikes are actually on top of the uncompacted tailings. Okay, now because the dam is actually on top of the material it's confining, these dams are highly susceptible to failure by liquefaction. If those tailings liquefy, the dam will simply fall into or slide over the liquefied material. Okay, Mount Poly, Samarco, Cohigu do Feijão, those were all upstream dams. Mount Poly Dam was converted into an upstream dam in violation of permits. These types of upstream dams are prohibited in Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru. Okay, So guideline 3, which should be obvious at this point, is to ban upstream dams at new facilities and close existing upstream facilities. Okay, now not everyone sees it that way. This is somewhat of a response from industry. Important paper called A Tale of 4 Upstream Tailings Dams. And that paper says the following. It says upstream dams are not necessarily inherently unstable and dangerous. They can be as safe as other types of dams, provided site conditions are favorable and that the rules for their safe design, construction, and operation are followed. Okay, that paper continues, this industry paper. Of the 10 rules, a score of 9 out of 10 will not necessarily have a better outcome than 2 out of 10, as any omission, okay, that is not following any one of the 10 rules creates immediate candidacy for an upstream tailings dam to join the list of facilities that have failed due to ignoring some or all of the rules. Okay, in other words, they describe upstream tailings dams as if it were a kind of ice climbing expedition where everything will be fine as long as you don't make any mistakes. But that is not the practice in high-risk industries, aviation, pipelines, ocean tankers, nuclear power, etc. We don't rely on a list of rules with the warning that if you break a single rule, there's going to be a disaster. There tend to be multiple backup systems, tend to be idiot-proof. They don't tend to rely on ideal conditions and high-quality personnel. And for that reason, we call for a prohibition on upstream dams. Okay, now, guideline 4. Any potential loss of life is an extreme event and design must respond accordingly. Okay, now the most extreme events that are theoretically possible at a given location are called the probable maximum flood and the maximum credible earthquake. So for any potential loss of life, even one, you design for those most extreme events. Otherwise design for the 10,000-year flood and the 10,000-year earthquake. And here we are following recommendations of the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency. Okay, guideline 5, mandate the use of best available technology, in particular, filter tailings. Okay, there has been a practice of using a surface cover of water on tailings to prevent oxidation of the sulfide minerals and acid mine drainage, and we say that is no longer a best practice. Okay, Mount Poly report said the same thing. It can be quickly recognized that water covers run counter to the BAT principles. The Mount Poly failure shows why physical stability must remain foremost and cannot be compromised. Okay, here's an example of a water cover, which is not a best practice. A Eustáquio Dam at the Morro do Ouro mine, biggest gold mine in Brazil, near Paracatu. Okay, we'll be seeing that mine in a bit more. Okay, guideline 6, implement rigorous controls for safety. If there's potential loss of life, the annual probability of failure must be less than 0.001%. Otherwise, the annual probability of failure must be less than 0.01%. Here we are following guidelines from U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Okay, more on guideline 6. New outer embankments must be constructed with slopes 1V to 5H, meaning 1 meter vertical to 5 meters horizontal or less. An additional fill must be added to existing outer embankments with the slope steeper than 1V to 5H in order to reduce the slope to 1 vertical to 5 horizontal. Okay, here we are following U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Many tailings dams in the world are not following this kind of rule. We see in that diagram the Kimi Dam at the Mirador mine in Ecuador, a Chinese-owned mine. This was constructed at 1 meter vertical for 1 meter horizontal, which is generally regarded as the point of collapse. Okay, guideline 7. Evaluate and characterize the dam foundation and the tailings and estimate their relationship to risk. Okay, here we are saying that acid mine drainage is so hazardous to the environment that if there's a risk of acid mine drainage, Again, the tailings dam should be designed to withstand the PMF and the MCE, maximum probable maximum flood, a maximum credible earthquake. Here we see the dam drainage pipes from the Santo Antonio Dam at the Tse Mohu to Odo mine. There was a water cover that was meant to prevent acid mine drainage. We see even that water cover wasn't working because acid mine drainage is just gushing out of the dam drainage pipes. Okay, guideline 11, consent of affected communities. Communities must provide consent for any tailings facility to be developed, operated, and closed. Okay, consent means the right to say yes and the right to say no. Indigenous peoples and affected communities must be afforded the opportunity to establish no-go zones and land use plans. For Indigenous peoples, international law recognizes that free, prior, and informed consent must be in place. Okay, so I've talked about 8 of the 16 guidelines. I invite you to read the entire document or a summary in the other guidelines. So happy to take any questions, but leave you with this picture. This is the village of Santa Rita in Minas Gerais in Brazil. And you can see in the background the tailings dam from the Santo Antonio Dam. That dam is 104 meters high and stores 394 million cubic meters of mine tailings, only 1 kilometer upslope from this village. Okay, and that should end my presentation. Let me unshare my screen.
Thank you, Steve, for that presentation. We appreciate it. Next, we're going to show a quick video from Hassan Lograt from the Benchmarks Foundation in South Africa.
Communities neighboring the mines have been systematically and structurally excluded from decision-making. When one is excluded, one is not present and generally shut out of processes, debates that deeply affect our lives. As civil society organizations, we have found creative ways of letting those in power hear us. Our governments and corporations do not listen to the plants, the water sources, the earth, mining communities, the poor and workers. As a result, we suffer pollution, sicknesses, and even death because of how corporations do business. We demand that the mining law be reformed to specifically include mining communities so that they can speak for themselves. We have a right to say no to destructive business practices in the mines or elsewhere.
All right, so that concludes our panel presentations for today. I'd like to, first of all, thank all the panelists for the insights and important information that you've brought to us today. And I'd also like to thank our interpreter, Eleni, for the interpretation from Portuguese to English. I think we're going to have to wrap up because there's a time constraint in this room. I'm sorry, could someone give me a thumbs up if they can hear me? Okay, thank you. We're going to wrap up because there are time constraints in this room here at the United Nations Environment Assembly, but I would like to encourage anyone to send questions to the email that was put in the chat. Also, we'll put a link in the chat for upcoming events in this room and encourage people to stick around. The next event is about environmental defenders and their work to protect the environment. Just to summarize, to finalize today, we've heard about the importance of holding the mining industry accountable to protect communities and ecosystems, and that includes making sure that communities have the right to say no to mining projects when they would put their livelihoods, there are people in danger. We also heard that there are concrete best practices that we can put into place to improve tailing storage facilities, and we need international agencies and governments to begin to promote those best practices to make sure that they come to fruition. So thank you everyone for participating. We will circulate a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered, and we can also share the slides as well. Have a great rest of your day and be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.